Welcome to the Friday edition of Juan's World, and as usual I'm actually recording this the day before, but it will air on the last day of the year, the New Year's Eve. And so I want to talk about New Year's Eve and New Year's Day recipes. So in some respects it's going to be the twin of my last episode, which was about Christmas cooking. So let's get into it. So it's mostly just going to be some stills, maybe a few videos here and there, but mostly stills, because I haven't done a lot of cooking this new year. 2 days ago, much to my surprise, my large manuscript on fieldwork methods got dumped in my inbox, and I got given 2 weeks to get it back. And I'm not quite ready for that. It's 125,000 words and lots of illustrations and URLs and all kinds of things that normally wouldn't be a problem, but it turns out that the proofreader has messed up just about everything, and all the corrections I made last time were not made, and so I have to do them all again, and so it's tough time. So I can't exactly slide down the hill from Christmas with as much grace as I might like, but I'm going to give it a try. And the thing is that for me, New Year's is just the middle of the descent down towards Epiphany. New Year's Day itself, which is the week from Christmas, is ecclesiastically recognized as the Feast of the Circumcision, because a week after a male birth in the Jewish tradition, the young infant is circumcised. And January 1st has not always been the New Year in the Western world, and it's certainly not the New Year in most cultures outside of modern European cultures. As you know, the Rosh Hashanah is the New Year in the Jewish tradition. Cambodia has its own New Year. China has its own New Year. And the Chinese New Year, like the Cambodian New Year, is geared to lunar months rather than solar months. And the Gregorian calendar took a long time to be adopted by many countries in Europe. It came into effect in the 16th century, but there was huge resistance in England because it was instituted by the Pope, and they were all Protestants. No, we're not doing this Catholic stuff. We're going to stay with the Julian calendar. So they didn't get on board with the Gregorian calendar until the 18th century, and the Russian Empire did not finally change over until the 20th century. And still within certain traditions, particularly the Eastern Orthodox tradition, the Julian calendar is still in effect, which is one of the reasons that the celebration of Christmas itself is different in different parts of the world. And around what Western Europe calls Epiphany, that is January the 6th, is sometimes called Old Christmas because it's approximately Christmas Day in some parts of the world still. So we'll get onto that later next week, assuming that I have the strength and the time to be able to keep going. I expect I will, but it's getting complicated. In parts of England, the New Year was celebrated according to different traditions. Halloween, for example, was New Year's Eve in certain Celtic parts, and then there was a financial New Year that was different from the secular, and the ecclesiastical New Year. As I already mentioned in previous videos, the turn of the ecclesiastical year in both the Catholic and the Episcopal traditions is the first Sunday in Advent. No, it's obviously it's arbitrary. When does the new year start? It starts when you decide. For a very long time in English history, the new year began on the anniversary of the accession of the monarch to the throne. And so it changed all the time. And there's a whole book that I used to have somewhere back in my library in New York, marking the accession dates of the different kings and queens of England, because you would read a manuscript and it would say, in the 50th year of the reign of Henry VI, and you had to look it up, like, okay, when was that? And church warden accounts often were different. They had different starting dates and so forth. So January 1st, as the beginning of the year, was a Roman innovation, and Janus was the god of two sides, as two heads, looking back into the old year, forward into the new year. And eventually the Gregorian calendar decided to adopt January 1st as its new year, emulating the old Roman year, to just kind of get everything sorted out. And the way we have things now is that we're ending 2021 and beginning 2022 as a sort of a universal change for everyone worldwide, because it makes bookkeeping and trade and travel and all those kinds of things normalized, so that you don't have to look up a flight to another country in their calendar, so that if you fly from, let's say, New York to Beijing, you don't have to figure out what the date is that you're leaving in New York and then figure out what date you're arriving in China based on the Chinese calendar. You've got to have something reasonably solid so that everyone knows what's happening. And that, of course, also happens with time zones. There was a 19th century period in England when every village kept its own time. And the way you keep time is to find out when it's midday, when the sun is exactly overhead. You can use a sextant or some other instrument to determine that. You determine when it's midday where you are, and you set your clocks to that, and there you go. Well, that's fine until you have railway travel, and then you get into real trouble trying to calculate the time that trains are supposed to arrive or leave or whatever. If the time in London is several minutes ahead of the time in Bristol, and so on. So they said, okay, well, we're going to have one time zone that is Greenwich Mean Time, and the whole of England is going to be on that. So some parts of the country are going to be a little out of sync with the sun, but it's okay because it's only a matter of minutes. And some countries, like China, for example, that are all on the same time zone, it can present problems because your actual celestial midday can be way off what the government says midday is. And so your sunsets and sunrises and all that kind of thing can be wildly off. But it's convenient. It's convenient for travel, it's convenient for communications, so that if somebody in the very western part of China wants to do business with somebody in the very eastern part of China, and they know that the business day begins at 9 o'clock, the person in one part of the country can pick up the phone at 9 at that local time and know that the person in the other place is also at 9 o'clock, even though the sun is in a completely different position. So world travel has made everything regularized to the inconvenience of a lot of people. And of course, a lot of people are reasonably upset that it was Western Europe that dictated when dates and times were going to be regularized, because particularly in the 19th century, places like Britain and France and Spain and Germany had huge colonies that dominated the world, and they made the rules and the rest of the world had to put up with it. And then of course during the 19th century and into the 20th century, a lot of colonies rebelled, but the system of times and dates remained and continues to remain, although locally we still have different passages of the new year. And that's fine. That means I get 3 New Years in Cambodia. I get the 1st of January, I get the Chinese New Year, and I get the Cambodian New Year. So I get to celebrate all 3, and that's fun. So let's talk more though about cooking. Because personally, I work on 2 basic traditions. One very old within my immediate family, and one that's a little bit newer. The older one is more or less a southern tradition from the United States. In the United States, there's a custom that says that you should eat poor on New Year's Day, then you will eat rich for the rest of the year. And to symbolize that, they have 2 particular dishes that are prominent. One of them is greens, usually collard greens, and you can see here's actually a dish called pot liquor soup, which I'll explain a little bit more about in a minute, but it's made with, traditionally anyways, not in this photo because I couldn't get collard greens, but it's traditionally made with greens because the green represents money. And the other tradition is black-eyed peas, and black-eyed peas symbolize coins. And let's just talk about 2 dishes for the moment, and then I'll move on a little bit. Pot liquor soup is made by taking the water that collards have cooked in and making a soup out of it with collard greens, some bacon or fatback, that's pork, and potatoes. And it's a particularly poor soup in a way, you know, because when you make collard greens in the South, you take a large pot of water and what they call a mess, that is a family's meal worth of collard greens and some fat pork or salt pork, and you put them on to boil after breakfast, and you let them boil and boil and boil and boil, and then you serve them at say 6 or 7 o'clock in the evening. when they've all boiled down to what's called greasy greens. Now, to make pot liquor soup, you take the water that the collards have been cooking in, and you turn it into soup with a little bit of the collards, a little bit of the pork or fatback or bacon or whatever you flavor it with, and you add some potatoes. So it's it's like cooking water soup, if you like. It's very rich in nutrients because it's been cooking all day, and I find it quite delicious. Perhaps a little bit salty for some people because the fatback is got a lot of salt in it, but it's quite delicious. And the black-eyed peas are normally made into a dish called Hoppin' John. Hoppin' John is also one of those, not exactly universal, but very, very widespread dishes of some kind of beans and some kind of rice, usually with a few odds and ends added for special occasions, but the main basis is beans and rice. And beans and rice is certainly universal in South America and large parts of North America. You can have black beans and rice, you can have red beans and rice, anything you want, but black-eyed peas and rice is called Hoppin' John and is a staple for New Year's Day in the American South, and I pretty much make that every year. So those are my two main dishes, but because I have a southern thing going on, I often make other southern dishes like hush puppies. Hush puppies are like the cornbread dough that you make cornbread out of, but instead of making the cornbread, you boil it up or make it into sausage shapes or whatever and deep fry it. And you can serve it with fish or with a variety of other things. So I often just figure out what kind of southern dish I might want, and I add that to the pot too. But this year, I found in the local supermarket some things that were called in the supermarket koiks seeds, which I didn't know what they were. They looked an awful lot like barley, so I thought, well, I'll buy them. And I got them home, and turns out that they're called Job's tears, mostly in the Western world, and they're a form of grass. Well, all of our major cereals are some form of grass or other. Wheat, rye, barley are all originally wild grasses that were domesticated. And the thing about domestication, which I'm actually writing about a great deal these days, is that the wild grasses were genetically modified so that the seed head became very tightly packed, as opposed to the wild grass seeds that were very loosely attached to the stalk. Now, wild grass needs the seeds to be loosely attached so that when they're ripe and a gust of wind comes along, the seeds scatter. That's great for the grass. It's not great for people who want to collect the seeds, because that means that if you cut the stalk, and particularly if you cut it with a stone tool, as they did in the Stone Age, then you go chop, chop, and most of the seeds fall off. But the ones that had tighter heads, where the seeds didn't fall off, were the ones that got collected more, because they didn't fall off, and they could be made into porridge or gruel or some kind of flatbread. With the downside that because the seeds didn't scatter by themselves, humans had to scatter them for the plants. That's how domestication evolved, was with the seed heads getting tighter and tighter, being more productive for the farmers, but giving the farmers the extra job of having to plant That's how domestication comes about. Well, some cereals were not domesticated. One of them was wild rice, which is a swamp grass, which has never fully been domesticated. You have to go out into the swamps in a boat and gather the wild rice seeds by hand. And Job's tears the same way. Well, I saw them in the store and thought, well, gosh, they look an awful lot like pearl barley, so I'll buy them and see how they are. And it turns out they're not so very different from pearl barley at all. You put them on to boil. They take about 45 to 50 minutes to cook. And when they're cooked, you can drain off the cooking liquid, and it can be used as a kind of soup or tea, which you can see here. And then the grains can be used pretty much like barley in a lot of ways. A lot of people eat the Job's tears cold, perhaps dressed with some olive oil or some other flavoring. You can actually also cook them in broth, and then they will have a little bit of additional flavor. Add some meat if you want, or some green vegetable, or what have you. So that's going to be the basis of my New Year's Day cooking this year. I'm going to turn these Job's tears seeds into my lunch on New Year's Day. Now there's New Year's Eve, and on New Year's Eve, very many years ago now, 35 years, I don't know, my wife and I were wondering, what could we do for New Year's Eve? And we just accidentally said to ourselves, okay, well, let's go down to the Japanese food market, which was near where we lived. It was called the Meidi-ya. And we often went there because they had fish that you could slice for sashimi or sushi, and they had burdock root and all kinds of Japanese ingredients, nori sheets, other kinds of seaweed, wakame, dashi stock and all of those great Japanese things that I love. So we said, let's go, on a whim, let's just go to the Japanese store. Well, and normally it was pretty empty. We were normally the only customers in it, even though there was a fairly large Japanese population, mostly of business people working at the headquarters of various companies in Westchester County. So it had a fair trade, but it was pretty slow most of the time. So we thought, well, that'll be simple because we can just go in and out. And we got there, and it was mobbed with people, because what we didn't realize was that New Year's Eve is a major holiday in Japan, and they have all kinds of traditional cooking. So we got a few things and we went home. But ever after that, we always made some kind of Chinese meal, Japanese meal, or we went out to a Japanese restaurant more often than not to have a Japanese meal on New Year's Eve. And I could do that this year, but I'm not going to, because it's a lot of work to get up and get out on New Year's Eve here in Phnom Penh and find a Japanese restaurant, which would probably be 8, 9, 10 kilometers away from where I live. So what I'm doing is a very classic New Year's Eve dish, which is soba. Now, soba are buckwheat noodles, and it's not complicated. You make them much like you would make any other pasta or noodles. You boil them up in stock, and in this case I'm using Japanese dashi, which is seaweed stock, and I've also added some fish cakes, which is also very, very traditional in Japanese households. And this is my New Year's Eve dish. Served hot, because soba can be served hot or cold. If it's served hot, it's usually served into soup that's fairly fairly rich and there's a lot of it. Or you can serve the soba cold, in which case you serve it with very, very little stock, if any at all, but with a dipping sauce. And I might do that a little later. I might not. I'm so busy with my writing that I'm not sure what I'm going to do. So anyway, that's New Year's Eve and New Year's Day. And I'm not sure whether I'm going to be able to do much on Tuesday because of my editing problems. But I'll certainly be back on Friday to wrap things up, to talk about Epiphany, also called Three Kings, the very tail end of the Christmas season, and leading on, a nice segue into Carnival, which is very, very common in both in Latin America and in Western Europe. That is, as soon as Christmas is over, you say goodbye to all of that. We're done with Christmas. Now let's start the party to get ready for the fact that in Lent we're going to have to fast a lot. So let's eat, drink, and be merry until then, and we'll dance and party, and then we'll put it all away until Easter. So until next time, have a very, very prosperous New Year, and I will see you hopefully on Tuesday.